The only potential risk with the national debt increasing over time is inflation. And to the extent that you don't believe the U.S. has a long-term inflation problem, you shouldn't believe that the U.S. is facing a long-term debt problem.
And unconventional economic theory is gaining some traction thanks to the policy teams of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders.
I think the first thing that we need to do is break the mistaken idea that taxes pay for 100% of government expenditure.
My critics say, you know, Bernie, that's a great idea. You're into all this free stuff. How are you gonna pay for it?
So MMT starts with a simple observation, and that is that the US dollar is a simple public monopoly. In other words, the United States currency comes from the United States government. It can't come from anywhere else. So what that means is that the federal government is nothing like a household. In order for households or private businesses to be able to spend, they've got to come up with the money, right? And the federal government, it can never run out of money. It cannot face a solvency problem, bills coming due that it can't afford to pay. It never has to worry about finding the money in order to be able to spend. So the deficit definitely matters. It's just that it matters in ways that we're not normally taught to understand. Normally, I think people tend to hear deficit and think it's something that we should strive to eliminate, that we shouldn't be running budget deficits, that they're evidence of fiscal irresponsibility. And the truth is, the deficit can be too big. Evidence of a deficit that's too big would be inflation, but the deficit can also be too small. It can be too small to support demand in the economy. And evidence of a deficit that is too small is unemployment. So if you think of the government deficit as the difference between what the government spends into the economy and what it taxes back out, then imagine a government that spends $100 into the US economy, but it only taxes 90 of those dollars back out. We label that a government deficit, and we record that on the government's books. But what we forget to do is pay attention to the fact that there's now $10 somewhere in the economy that wouldn't have been there otherwise, that is put there by the government's deficit. In other words, their deficits become our surpluses. And so when we talk about red ink and the government having all of this red ink, we have to remind ourselves that their red ink becomes our black ink, and their deficits are our surpluses. And the question is then, should you expand fiscal policy? Should you run bigger budget deficits in order to boost growth? So what is the objective? What is the proper policy goal? And I think the right policy goal is to maintain a balanced economy where you're at full employment, you're guarding against an acceleration in inflation risk. And economists tend to understand that the kinds of things that you can do to boost longer-term growth are investments in things like education, infrastructure, R&D. Those are the sorts of things that tend to accelerate productivity growth so that longer-term real GDP growth can be higher. So there are ways in which the government can make investments today that increase deficits today, that produce higher growth tomorrow, and build in the extra capacity to absorb those higher deficits. So it's impossible really to put a number. Nobody can. How much debt is too much debt? If you look at Japan today, you see a country where the debt to GDP ratio is something like 240%, well above, orders of magnitude above where the US is today, or even where the US is forecast to be in the future. And so the question is, how is Japan able to sustain a debt of that size? Wouldn't it have an inflation problem? Wouldn't it lead to rising interest rates? Wouldn't this be destructive in some way? And the answer to all of those questions, as Japan has demonstrated now for years, is simply no. Japan's debt is close to 240% of GDP. almost a quadrillion, that's a very big number, yen. Long-term interest rates are very close to zero. There's no inflation problem. And so despite the size of the debt, there are no negative consequences as a result. And I think Japan teaches us a really important lesson. If you think about what happened after World War II, when the US national debt went in excess of 100%, close to 125% of GDP. If we were talking about it the way we talk about it today, as burdening future generations, as posing a grave national security risk, we would have to scratch our heads and say, wait a minute, do we think that our grandparents burdened the next generation with all of those bonds that were sold during World War II to win the war, build the strongest middle class, produce the longest period of peacetime prosperity, the golden age of capitalism? All of that followed in the wake of fighting World War II, increasing deficits, massively increasing the size of the national debt. And of course, the next generation inherits those bonds. They don't become burdens to the next generation, they become their assets. The only potential risk with the national debt increasing over time is inflation. And to the extent that you don't believe the US has a long-term inflation problem, you shouldn't believe that the US is facing a long-term debt problem. So the best defense against inflation is a good offense. And what MMT does is to try to be, I think, kind of hypersensitive to the risks of inflation. I don't see any other macro school of thought pay as careful attention as we do to the inflation risk question. And so what we would say is, look, if you are Congress and if you are considering a new spending bill, instead of thinking about the ways in which that new spending will add to the deficit or add to the debt, you should be thinking about the ways in which that new spending has the risk of accelerating inflation, and then avoid doing that. So instead of going to the Congressional Budget Office and saying, we'd like to know what this bill will do to the debt and the deficit over time, instead, go to the Congressional Budget Office or other government agencies and say, we're considering passing this $1 trillion investment in infrastructure. This is our bill. Would you look at it? And we plan to do this spending over the course of the next 5 years. Tell us if that would create problems in the real economy. Evaluate the inflation risk and come back to us and give us some feedback. That's the kind of responsible budgeting that I think that I would like to see Congress begin to move towards. So the question about what to do if inflation becomes a problem is a different one. And I think the first thing you have to do is say, what is driving the inflation? Because to think that the inflation that is going to become important at some future date is likely to be the result of too much aggregate spending is really hard to believe. I mean, the US economy hasn't experienced what we might call demand pull inflation for almost a century. The types of inflation that have been important in the US have almost always come on the cost side, what we call cost push inflation. They come about because of things like oil price shocks. You might see increases in headline inflation rates because the housing component or healthcare. And so when you think about how to fight inflation, if you've got inflation resulting from energy price increases, it's probably not going to do much to have the Fed raise interest rates or even to have Congress raise taxes. You've got to do something else that's going to work. So I reject the idea that MMT is about using taxes to fight inflation. That's a mischaracterization of pretty much everything we've written, but people say it all the time.